we want to use. The panel's been very firm the whole entire time that we want to give incentive to fifth-year graduates. Scott, are you wanting to make a recommendation that we might be able to?
Yeah, I think with that discussion, I think, again, understand it, both, it either be option 2 or option 3, both of them are only going to help. And I think with that explanation, 2, I think makes better sense because you're actually looking at the rates and it's being additive instead of you're diluting the other one with the combination. So I'd be comfortable with option 2, and I'll defer to my learned colleague, Mr. Baker, to weigh in as well.
Well, since he's not here, I will say that, yes, I do agree with that. And again, I just don't want to get into this, well, schools will play games, but we're just so far past that. We're here to help our students. We don't look at that. We look at the student, and this simply rewards schools for going the extra mile, which we're doing anyway, but it now just shows up. That's the best way of saying it. It just now shows up on our grade card. So I would be very much in favor of option 2.
All right. Do we have a consensus to that, or do we need to take an actual vote? See some head nods. Do we have consensus for option 2?
If you don't mind, I just want to make the comment. Was there any look at state law? Would there be any conflict with law? Does the panel need to make a recommendation to the board about revising state law? Have we talked about any perverse incentives that this might lead to? And I completely respect your point, Steve. I think hopefully this work is already happening. This is just recognizing it. I just want to make sure we're not carefully thinking about unintended consequences.
Well, and I think that's a good point. But I still, because of the way that we've got so heavily weighted the 4-year rate, because I tried to think through that, right? You know, people saying, well, I'm going to hold a kid over to the 5th year and you get such a penalty on that 4-year rate. I think there's no way, because this is really just going to give you, I don't know whether it's what it works out to numerically, but a partial return on that student in that 5th year versus, you know, I'm still going to try. I mean, I have probably a large number of them. I'm still going to work really hard to get students done in 4 years because that's where the reward is. I mean, I'd love to have 0 5th years because I got them all in the 4th year, right? Because that's where I get the big reward. If I can't, and I think Steve's example is a good one where you get kids that transfer in late, you're getting, because you're the last one holding on to them, now you at least get something back. I think that's really where it is. And I think this is not totally dissimilar to what was partially implemented, or I guess not implemented, but in the current model,
right,
with that bonus for 5th year. So we have some precedents that it was in the model and it's there. We never implemented it, but this kind of is that, I hate to use the word bonus because it's really not, but it is including those students in the calculation somewhere.
Now the counterweight to that was you would get a penalty for an increase in waiver diplomas, right? I think, and the board talked about you didn't want to have an incentive for issuing more waiver diplomas, which are not going to be as high currency value for a student in the workplace. So do we need to talk about that as well?
Not from where I'm standing. I like the way this stands on its own. I think it muddies the water personally. Gary?
I'm trying to absorb this thing. I think I'm just realizing something. So option 2 appears to me is doing calculations on grades. So you're not adding or subtracting students from cohorts and recalculating the grades. You're let's see, like you're taking the current 4-year rate and then adding the difference between last year's 5-year rate and 4-year rate, right?
That's correct.
I get a little concerned that I have to think through it more and try to really look at numbers that initially adding rates is not a very good idea. It's usually better if you're going to do things that you look at actual counts. I think option 3 does generally the same thing, but it keeps it to a count issue rather than a rate issue. It's usually not good to add rates because rates
Claire, does option 3 better address what you brought up?
I think in concept, I very much support the idea of making sure that schools are getting credit for the work that they're doing. I just want to be mindful of, there was a concern, I think, in the past when the board talked about this, about not having a spike in waiver graduates, which again is not necessarily going to help that student anymore. And so is that a false sense of promise for that student? So I want to make sure we're just thinking through any unintended consequences.
And I know there was a concern overall with a fifth-year graduate, however you package it. They were just concerned with staying on the 4-year cohort percentage. Now, this was last time we went to 8F, so it's been
Right, it's been a few
ago.
years.
So I don't know where that stands now, but I know the fifth-year graduation rate has been a topic of concern. I don't know how that stands now.
Option 3 definitely puts it in the student realm. You
Yeah,
know, puts it focused totally on the student.
Yeah. And further, I mean, I'd be fine with either one. I
With
mean, either
either
one
one.
accomplishes the idea of rewarding schools for keeping schools around. And again, if we're uncomfortable with, to Derek's point of adding rates, which I agree statistically probably may not be a stellar idea, especially when you get small cohorts and you can have some big rate differences. If you just look at the number of students, I'm fine with either one. I think 2 or 3 accomplishes what we want to do, which is give an incentive, small, but an incentive to keep students around. I'd be okay with either.
So why don't we just have a show of hands for option 3? Option 2? Okay. Option 3?
Thanks for the input.
And we will adjust that in the multiple measures resolution. Is that correct, Deb? We'll be adjusting that. Okay. You were sent the resolutions on multiple measures domain. Are there other suggestions or changes to the resolution on multiple measures? I would like to add that, at least a final note, that we will continue to study. It's recommended that we continue to study to see if there are any viable multiple measures that the board may want to pursue at some point. So we will be adding to the multiple measures the outcome that we just talked about. And in addition, talk about the study of multiple measures in the future. Any other changes that you can see that we might need to make?
I just wanted to point
Yeah,
out
Claire.
that Debbie and Cynthia Roach worked on calculating the current CCR data, and we have some of that information. So it's probably there's no time to talk about it now, but when we last talked about this spring, we said we'd like to see the data and possibly recommend an increase, but that was kind of pending data. So I think that's important for the board to know that there is now some data, and I think most schools exceed 25%. So I think it's probably time to revisit what that should be, and it would be helpful to have the panel weigh in on that too. I think it's reflected fine in that resolution now. It says we're going to look at it, but I just want to let you know that data are available now. Those data are available.
All right. I think we'll go ahead and, I believe we did, Alan, did we do roll call on the first resolution? So we should do that again. So why don't you go ahead and do that? Thank you.
Steve Gaither? Yes.
Oh, did you say Steve Baker?
Did you say Steve
Okay.
Baker?
Jaeger.
I'm sorry. Sorry, going alphabetical order.
All kinds of things I could say.
I know. Please leave that alone.
Yes.
Linda Rich,
Yes.
Steve Baker,
Yes.
And please speak into the microphones.
Scott Bass,
Yes.
Derek Bowman. Yes. Jessica Dunn Feaser,
Yes.
Kane Robbins,
Yes.
Sheila Steenhouse. Yes. Claire Finian Green,
I'd sent some recommended, or changes to Danielle and Debbie last night, and my vote would reflect those changes. So if we're voting on the current version, then my vote would be no, but it would be yes if those changes that I sent were reflected.
Did you indicate those here so that we all know?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The first was that,
Are they on the multiple measures?
yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Well, wait a minute, I guess we're in the middle of voting, so.
Oh, I'm sorry, then no.
But I had asked if there were any other changes that we needed to consider.
Okay. Sorry, I must have
So,
not heard that correctly.
so what's the panel's pleasure? We want to hear all the changes before we do votes, right? All right, so Claire, go ahead and talk about any changes that you had to multiple measures.
The second to last whereas clause on page 2, this actually needs to be changed throughout all of the resolutions, but the vote last November from the State Board of Ed was only on changing the scale from 4.0 to 100%. And this says, as written, that the framework recommended by the panel was approved by the State Board of Ed, so I just wanted to note that that should be corrected to align with the records from the State Board of Ed last November. On page 3, I just mentioned the 25%, so as long as the State Board of Ed is aware that 25%, according to current data, is going to be too low, it's kind of a free point right now for schools, that I'd want to make sure the State Board is aware of that. Under participation, the comment that I had was, because this is not defined, it seemed funny to me to include it in a resolution. I think maybe we could have a list of things to kind of further investigate, especially because the Career Council right now is doing the mandated review of the Core 40 diploma requirements, and that seems to kind of fit into that category. So those were just the comments that I had. Oh, I'm sorry, and at the end, on page 4, I didn't understand why the return on investment weight would exceed 50%, but I think this is going to be reflective from what we just voted on. Is that correct?
Correct.
Great. So then that becomes a moot point.
So can I ask a question about what you meant under participation?
Sure.
You mean participation is not currently defined in rule? Or,
So it says here the current goal is not defined for schools, and their panel recommends review of the available assessment suite because we haven't actually finalized that yet. So I think I was just wondering why we had something where we don't have the information. Why would that be part of a framework recommendation at this time?
could you specifically point out what it is you're referring to, which letter?
Yes, I'm sorry, page 3, under 2 participation D subsection 2. So we haven't yet figured out what will the 11th grade assessments be that would be acceptable, especially some of like the we've talked about work keys and a few other things for career readiness. So in light of the fact that this isn't finalized, to have us vote on something for a framework where we don't have that data yet just seemed premature.
So are you recommending, what are you recommending to change here? Because the resolution's really saying that this needs to be determined. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not we know it's not final.
I think, again, if we're trying to recommend our best information at this time, since we don't have the information, it seems premature to include it in the resolution. So that's just my perspective.
Well, I'll just say that I think the resolutions serve two purposes. One is to give a current accounting of where we are, and two, to talk about things that we have yet to determine.
Okay.
Superintendent,
Yes.
if I may, I conferred with Alan on your first point, Claire, on the whereas, the 8th whereas on page 2. So it reads currently, whereas on November 13th, the State Board affirmed the framework recommended by the panel. I know lots of changes that happened since those 19 elements, Claire, and we've kind of outlined them in this decision history. So he's suggesting that maybe it reads, on November 13th, the State Board affirmed the framework recommended by the panel as outlined in the Accountability System Review System final report written by them. So it's just basically saying on that meeting date, the State Board did adopt that report submitted.
Actually, they
and
did not.
changes have made.
They did not. That was the whole conversation we had at that board meeting. The only thing the board approved was changing the 4.0 to the 100-point scale. So I just didn't want there to be reflected in these resolutions that the board approved the whole framework, because that did not happen last November.
Is it a whereas that we would?
Well, would it be better to just put in the actual motion that was approved?
We could do that.
Yeah, the motion speaks to the framework, I believe, but we could put in the actual motion.
Or Alan also suggested maybe potentially strike that whereas.
Well, that's true. It's not like we need to have it in there. Why don't we just do that?
So it will be stricken in all 4 resolutions.
Any other discussion on changes?
I just would like to address the comment on page 3 of the resolution. Claire's comment about II, that's the one I'm referring to. Current goal presented in Indiana is 25% for CCR. I am in favor of that discussion of the right time and the right way of raising that. However, this is what I want to be very, very clear on. There are more and more things being added to the requirements of what will be accepted as CCR for points with the DOE. We don't know, because I've got, just in the last AccuPlacer concerns, is this going to take a role in, this question is being out there, is that going to take a role in the student must perform so well on that in order to get the dual credit? Is there going to be additional things put on schools besides just what the higher ed is placing on us? IPFW, for me, their requirements, I'm now hearing that may not be enough, which makes this a lot more difficult to obtain. So I would just really caution before we raise that 25%, which I'm in favor of, we get things like that worked out. Because the worst thing that would happen, we'll raise it to, 33 sounds good, 40% sounds good, which I'm okay with. And then all of a sudden we have, and by the way, you must now do this in order to get your dual credit point tally with the DOE for your grade. And I think we have to be very, very cautious before we raise that 25% that we, once again, I'm going to say this, I'm okay with playing the game, but I need to know what those rules are ahead of time. I don't like getting told after the fact, by the way, here's one more thing. So no one's being deceptive. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying these things have not been settled yet. And I would rather these things get settled first before we talk about raising that percent. Because that percent data that Claire's talking about is the way it currently is, not the way it could be. And that is a huge difference, and I would make sure everyone is educated on that before that discussion takes place.
Yes, and I think the resolution reflects that we need to have that dialogue.
I think we've changed enough. We can go with 25 until we can research it and see if it works. But just to willy-nilly go to 30
Right.
or 30, that's ridiculous.
Based upon especially what might be added to the requirements, I totally agree.
Okay, I think we're ready now. Would you please start the roll call again? Thank you.
Steve Yeager.
Yes.
Linda Rich.
Yes.
Steve Baker.
Yes.
Scott Best.
Yes.
Derek Brenneman. Yes. Jessica Dunn-Feather.
Yes.
Shane Robbins.
Yes.
Sheila Seahouse.
Yes.
Claire Fidian Green.
Yes.
Eric McCoskey.
Who? Here, how about Rick?
Rick.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your vote.
Yes. I didn't hear the name.
You didn't recognize his name.
Yes.
Shut up.
Robert Lugo. Yes. Cheryl Ramsey. Jim Snap.
Yes.
Michelle Walker.
Yes.
Terry Wicker.
Since the board is going to be hearing these again later and voting on them later, I'm going to abstain abstain until the board takes their vote.
The recommendation as amended has passed, 14 to 0.
Thank you very much. On the next portion of our agenda is the review of the growth measure resolution. And we sent you many reiterations of option D at the request of different calculation to be performed as a result of our last meeting. And so you received copies of that, and we've also put at your table an actual paper copy of the observed growth component development that Deb put together at the request of the panel, showing how the reiteration went from C to D, and so making sure that that was very clear on how that worked. And I guess we might want to entertain questions regarding that report first. We want to make sure everybody's comfortable with how the target range was derived. And really, page 6 of that report was the aha moment for me, because we really worked with the mean growth that was determined. And I thank Deb for spelling everything out in here to show how that was derived at. So Deb, if you want to make any comments or anybody has any questions, we want to be sure everybody understands how target range was arrived.
Perfect. So Superintendent Ritz said, after discussions in the last panel meeting, we did go back and write additional detail on how each of the components within option D were actually derived, and really the components across all of the various options we were looking at. So for example, within this report, the questions were raised of how did we get to the actual cut scores between the different categories? How did we establish the point values between those categories? How did we establish the target ranges, et cetera? So this report really details all of that information, the analysis that was done by DOE, as well as CECI staff and our experts in the field to get to each of those components. So at the pleasure of the panel, we can either go through each section or just entertain questions that you might have on any of these components.
And to put that in perspective, if you look at in your packet that you have in your PowerPoint, if you look at page 17, the sample of the chart, and we did use F2 as the sample for values, that target range, if you look at the ranges that you have there, you can see by the mean growth on those charts on page 6 that they are reflected. Is that correct?
That's correct.
On this actual chart of target range.
That is correct. So again, when we're taking a look at, which section are we in right now? We're taking a look at the prior year status and trying to define the cut scores between all of the subcategories. One of the components that we dove into and really took a look at was utilizing growth to ensure that we had a reasonable distribution, and we were actually seeing a differentiation in the performance in each of these levels. So again, to Superintendent Ritz's point on page 6, taking a look at these charts, when we dove into the mean student growth in each category, again, focusing on those students in particular that weren't changing categories. So for each of the starting categories, we saw this incrementing mean growth across each of these categories. One, that was able to provide some evidence that we did in fact see a change in the performance in each of these categories. And two, did become that aha moment of we do in fact have different target values or different ranges in each of these subcategories. It was part of this analysis that then morphed, if you will, into our option D of being able to establish those targets for each of the starting subcategories.
So you had a chance, I hope, to look at the different options that we gave you, the different reiterations. And looking at page 17, F2, actually, I feel at least, reflects the values of the panel that we had in C, where we did not want, where we wanted to give more emphasis on students who had passed the pass mark, and even more emphasis on students that were already at the pass plus level. And we did not value having points, large points arrived if you were in the do not pass area and not yet passing the proficiency lines. So the spread that you have on this is actually displayed on 18 at the top, and you can see the comparison between the current A to F model. We do have a disclaimer on there that these are totally two different calculations with the two models. So we actually, comparing them is not necessarily accurate. But you can see the spread of what you have under the performance.
Derek?
Can you explain what the target range numbers represent? When you say 0 to 41, what does 0 to 41 represent?
The 0 to 41 represent the targeted observed growth for the student in the current year. So the baseline calculations out of the Indiana growth model produce the observed growth component. So for that student, the target would be 0 to 41. Their observed growth would be compared to that target. If they're within that range, the point values would be assigned accordingly. If they're within the next range, which would be 42 to, I'm not certain, I don't have the chart in front of me, let's 66, 42 to 66, and they're awarded those points for the static movement column. And if it's 67 or beyond, then they do get the points associated with the positive movement column.
I understand how it works in the model. What I'm asking is, what do the points actually represent? It's obviously not a scale score, as we've been dealing with in the past. So what do those numbers represent?
It is actually their observed growth score, so it is the outcome of the the baseline SGP Indiana growth model analyses. So that's the, it is not a percentile. Again, it's the lookup table that is created through the baseline system, baselining SGP analyses. So it is a lookup table. So you're getting a score associated with that. That's
Lookup table is where you put numbers. So what was done to calculate the numbers that you put in the lookup table?
It is the Indiana growth model calculations, again, using multiple years' worth of data to establish those lookup tables, creating that baseline information.
So it sounds like a percentile. I'm not hearing it described any other way. You said it's a student growth, we're using SGP to calculate that. So I'm not sure if it's not a percentile, what is it? I'm not saying what is the number mean?
The difference here is that the student growth percentiles is actually the norm referenced calculation. When you move to baseline, it's a criterion calculation. While the number will look very similar, it is actually the score that's achieved. Again, it's not normed every year. It is criterion using the baseline information. So we're actually then returning a score. Another terminology could be baseline SGP. However, I believe observed growth is a much better term for this.
So we're setting the baseline, but students are earning their points based upon their own performance each year.
Are we able to say that going into the future, these target ranges are not going to change, or are they going to float every year?
They are not changed, and we do recommend a review like every 5 years, but they are not changed.
So we'll be able to say that there's probably some norm referencing that went into the creation of these numbers, but they're made criterion reference because we modified the norm reference score to be the criterion to which the kids are supposed to be moving toward. Is that accurate?
I believe people could make the argument that the entire work of the accountability panel of running data runs would bring in some sort of norming, if you will. Even taking a look at the categorical components where we redefined and reprocessed our cut scores and our values based on the outcome of the data could then also be deemed as some norm referencing or norming of some data. But essentially, yes, we do need to look at prior year data to ensure that we're not arbitrarily establishing some sort of goal.
But Rick, you are correct in how you said that.
Derek? So there is, I just want to confirm, there is nothing in these numbers that represent or refer in any way to the proficiency measures that have been determined by the State Board of Education in the development of standards and ISTEP.
I'm not sure I'm following your question.
State Board of Education has adopted standards. They've gone further to adopt cut scores on ISTEP. By our NCOB compliance and also in documents put out by the Department of Education, proficiency has been defined as passing or pass plus. In other words, getting over the pass bar on ISTEP. I'm assuming, I'm understanding, from what you're saying is that there is nothing in these numbers that represent the proficiency definitions that have been set by the State Board of Education through the adoption of standards and the adoption of cut scores on our state tests.
I would say that understanding is incorrect. Those targets that were established are the targets that are associated with students being able to move up or stay proficient. Therefore, I feel that they are in line with meeting proficiency
And
standards.
I think that's the very point in our last discussion that we wanted to be sure was reflective in our chart. That kind of component working towards proficiency in the pass area was reflected in our actual chart. So if we recall, we had looked at a chart previous that actually had the same points given to students. The reiterations thereafter were requested to reflect the values of this panel. So as you can see on the sample on F2, DF2, there is the value put forth to really address what it is that you just said, Derek, to be sure that students are rising to the proficiency level that's established with the cut scores of our assessment. And that would be the pass line. And so you can see in the do not pass zone, the points awarded. I am looking on page 17 at the sample chart. And so the points reflect that exact value that you just indicated, that we want to be sure that students are rising to proficiency levels. And so the points awarded for student growth are in that reflection and the increase of that. And Jim, I reached out to you special because you had requested several reiterations of this. I guess I'd just like to hear from you your views on DF2 perhaps, or any of them. I know we had some conversation. I wanted to be sure we did what you asked.
With the model that was presented, I think there was some effort made in that direction. I still reserve some concern about which Rick and Derek have shared tonight about how that's originally comprised to get there. I think this is a step in the right direction with one of the models that was offered, but I still think that our thinking may be too narrow at this late date. It's hard to look at other options that don't lock in on that one piece.
Okay, thank you very much.
But certainly do appreciate the effort. I know that was not easy, so thank you.
So, and the model going forward, there has to be recalculations of the table because we're going to have a whole new assessment. So there's, but we want to make sure that we're reflecting the values of the committee in the chart going forward.
If I could ask a question on because one of the things that I don't know that I was crystal clear on last meeting, and it really comes to, because I understand how the targets are set, right? So we're going to jump out and we're going to do some peer-based comparisons and we're going to get growth targets, right? And in order for those to be accurate, while you could do it with 2 years of data, the recommendation is more 3 years or 4 years of data, right? To really get a more clear and consistent target set that you would then be your target for some number of years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, whatever it turns out to be. To the superintendent's point of the assessments changing, my question last week, I walked away and thought about it some more, and I'm thinking, I'm not sure it got answered, which was, we're changing assessments kind of this year. It's a transition year. So we're gonna have one assessment. Next year, we're going to have a new assessment. Next year is the year in which we're supposed to have a new accountability system based on this. And so, but we have two different assessments. We have a 2014-15 assessment this year, right, which is based on ISTEP with some additions. Is that
No. In fact, we will have 2 years, well, maybe I could have Michelle speak in my behalf, but we will have 2 years of the same assessment, College and Career Ready. So we are fully going to have a College and Career Ready assessment this year. There will be no old Indiana academic standards assessed. So it's going to be totally operational. So we will have 2 full years of data prior to the implementation of the growth
okay, so
of
maybe
the model.
Again, Michelle, you can help me out here maybe a little bit. So this year's test that we're giving in the spring is the
Yes.
same as the test we're going to give next year?
Yes.
Yes.
Same vendor, same everything,
Well, does it matter who the vendor is? We actually own the items, so.
same items, same test, okay. So, but then we're going to have 2 years of data. And I think the question is from an accuracy standpoint and setting the targets, is that, I know we can, the question is, should we, right? I mean, that's going to be, and I think that'll be the debate that people are going to say is, you've got the first 2 years of assessment, and really the first year is helping set the target. And is that accurate? Is that desirable? Is that where it needs to be? I think most, at least from what I've read a little bit in terms of research, is you really want 3 or 4 years of data to accurately set this stuff, and you're going back. And we're doing this on the minimum in the first 2 years of assessment. I think that's going to be an interesting target setting with this. So I don't know if you can help me get comfortable with that.
Sure. So Dr. Bedebetter actually provided some additional information, and I believe that report was distributed, is that correct, to all of the panel members, specifically around transitioning or rolling out this type of option. So your understanding about having 2 years minimum data is absolutely correct. 2 years of data is sufficient to do baseline. It's not recommended that we lock in a baseline based on 2 years of information and keep that baseline for multiple years. Therefore, he provided some different options of what to do until we get to the 3 or 4 years data. Basically, our options in this are we can roll it out with the 2-year baseline, take a look in year 3 to establish if we want to reset those baselines that year, or wait until year 4 and reset it on 4 years worth of data. So I think the options are really specific to how many years worth of data, how many times do we want to reset our baseline in that time period.
So I think that's a key point as we communicate whatever comes out of this is, I think, and Rick asked a question about, is this going to be a consistent set of targets? The answer is, in the first iteration of this, probably not. You're going to have one target, you're going to have kids go, presumably do something, and then we're going to, because we had minimal data and new assessments, we're going to reset the target. So in year 3 of this, maybe year 4, there's going to be new targets and new calculations, and then maybe at that point in time, the targets are going to be consistent for a while, right?
So ideally, the targets that are established on each of our options would remain static, and we would not need to adjust that information. So the targets should remain the same on our values table. What would change is behind the scenes the actual matrices of what the observed growth calculation would be. And whether that's based on 2 years of information, 3 years of information, or locked in at 4 years of information for a period of time. As well as how often do we need, and Claire brought up this point before, how often do we need to take a look at those baselines and reestablish baselines? Generally, those baselines do get reset after a period of time. Do we want 4 years, 5 years? What's the recommended number of years? That's definitely some work that I'd like to continue to work with Damien on, to have some recommendations on how many years we should hold that static before we consider baseline reset.
And again, I apologize.
And
Stop asking
Scott, your
questions.
point's well taken, because every time we switch to a new accountability system, we have that same anxiety, about what is it, that we're actually doing. So, your point's well taken.
Okay. So last question on this, because I think, again, one of the things that's important, at least from, again, feedback I've gotten after presentations is, and I think, because I want to clarify what you said, so the the, the table on page 17 might stay the same, right?
Mhm.
But the calculations behind the scene would be different. And I think that really, for me, that's a heart of the matter kind of issue, because, and I'll use Derek's question on the scale score. So what school leaders, principals, and others, what they know about students is what their scale score was. They know what it was last year, and they know what it is this year. And if they can't, and this is, I know there's another lookup table. Now, we haven't, and I know you haven't had time to develop and show us, right? Because I think that would be extraordinarily helpful to say, here's the other lookup table, and it has scale scores on it, right? And not magic calculations, because I know today that's the way it works, right? It's, you got a scale score, but then there's a magic calculation that happens that no one can replicate because we don't have access to the data, and then it comes back and you go, oh, I guess that kid didn't do very well. I thought they did. And I want to make sure and really, really crystal clear that what we're doing here isn't that, right? So that there is a table that someone can look at and say, yep, this student scored a 1132 or 506 or whatever the numbers are, and that's good. Now, when a student went from this score to this score last year, it was worth this many points. Evidently, the targets got reset, and now that same movement is worth less points because the targets changed. But they can still go see that and not just get something back that says, oh, that wasn't good, or that was great, right? I mean, I think I really want to make sure that the lookup table has actual scale scores in it that you can see. Is that correct?
That's correct, and that's where it drills down into the scale scores would be in that lookup table. Yep,
And then they would have a corresponding observed growth score.
correct.
And then Sheila, I think you requested to have some information regarding grade level movement of schools, and so we did provide that for you as well. Did you have any particular comments you might want to make about the data that you saw?
Thank you for pulling it together. Oh, you're welcome.
You're welcome. So with that,
Can I, I'm sorry, just one question.
Sure.
To help me understand, I'm really trying to make the transition from this, which I was really getting good at, to page 17, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about, right?
right.
I mean, in simple Steve Baker terms, that's what we're doing here. We're going from this to page 17.
We are. So
Okay.
on this, we're essentially taking that diagonal that's shaded and the band that surrounds it,
We
where
flipped it.
most of the movement is up one level, down one level, and we're pivoting that
Right.
and looking at that rather in the absolute status change and what did their observed growth tell us they're going to do. So again, if you read through this paper, what we found was in looking at this information, 90 to 95% of the time, the observed growth matches the actual status change.
Okay. So when we were saying things like, and people really liked about it, if you're growing but still not passing, that has value. That has some
Correct.
value that didn't have before, especially at the high school level. We had none,
Correct.
correct? And if I'm at the top and staying at the top, that still has some significant value.
Correct.
So the person that we heard over and over and over again who had a perfect score one year and dropped a point or two, that is not a negative in this new model,
No.
okay? And that if I'm not growing and I'm staying stagnant, that still has some value, but not as much as growing. And if I'm going down, then I don't receive negative or penalty points. I'm just getting fewer points. So is that correct?
That's correct. So if we take a look at your starting status of a Pass 1, for example, and we look, and it's right in the middle of that table, and we provided a certain value for those students that are staying static. When we transition to option D, that static value is reflective of the static value on option D as well. So again, through analyzing all of the data behind the scenes, what we found is the students' observed growth actually does provide a range of growth scores that is consistent with a student staying static. So rather than defining all of the different end statuses, we've instead focused on their observed score. Instead, if they're in this range, they are in fact staying static. Or are on a trajectory to move up.
So,
If they're-
so very quickly, tell me what this, I know you said it before, I want to hear it again. What this lacked something that option D gives us, was it that if, what was it, 40% or 60 stayed within the category?
Correct.
But moving within the category
Correct.
is basically option D, and that gives us more accurate data and more accurate value of points? Is that?
Correct. So if you think of the 60% of students that are moving on our option B categorical, we've encompassed those in option D with the positive and negative movement. Again, looking at the data behind the scenes on this, there are those incremental changes in their actual growth that we can observe. So instead of saying option P1 did move to a P2, P3, pass plus 1, pass plus 2, we said that they had that range of observed growth that did in fact move them up, so we're awarding those points. If they're going the negative direction and they did move down, then their growth was also reflective of that, and we awarded those points as well based on the growth. For those students that stayed static, again, they could have growth that showed that they were in the positive trajectory, which is what we were looking at under option C. So they as well get those points for being on that trajectory to move up, the same way as the student that did in fact move up. If they were on a negative trajectory to move down, they're awarded those points for the student, same as the students that did in fact move down. And the remainder of the students that were absolutely flat, didn't change a status, and show no trajectory to change a status, are in the static category. So it really rolls it all together and encompasses 100% of the students.
So this still has value in
It
what we're
does.
talking about
Oh,
and
you betcha.
explaining, though the page 17 just kind of goes behind the numbers, more in the categories more, helps explain in more detail, but this is more of a general, but just not fully, it's not fully representative of actually everything that's going on.
Correct.
Okay, think I have it. We're not.
So all of the work on all the categorical was really rolled into the final option D. All of the information that we reviewed, the values, et cetera,
Okay.
were rolled
Thank
in.
you.
So you have been sent the resolution for the growth, and it does reflect the information that we have discussed here this morning. Do we have any changes that need to be presented before we actually approve the resolution on growth? Claire, did you have anything else for the growth?
The questions that I sent last night were, there was new language in here that I don't recall discussing, changing the top 75 and bottom 25% to higher and lower performing. If that is the language that is going to be the pleasure of the panel, there was a typo I noticed under math that said higher twice instead of higher and lower. And I just wanted to ask the question why the department was recommending that language.
Oh, we certainly aren't changing anything. I think the terms were always there. They're reflected in all the pieces we've had, and I think,
It was probably a very brief discussion with the panel close to a year ago at this point about the bottom 25, top 75% terminology, and the fact that some other states just have branded it different. So we moved forward with that change in
Yes,
branding.
we know.
Behind the scenes, it's the exact same calculation, so I think it really is the pleasure of the panel on whether they want to stay with the consistent language that people are familiar with or transition that branding to higher performing and lower performing. Again, it was some time ago.
yeah, we haven't changed anything, I don't believe.
Okay, thanks. I guess I don't remember that.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, it's been on there the whole time.
I also wanted to let the panel know that we asked Dr. Derek Briggs to do his own independent assessment of option D and Damien's analysis of option D. Because we only got the information to him recently, he wasn't able to do that for today, but he said he would get it to the board on October 15th. So I just wanted to know that was happening, to have an independent assessment. The one thing I did ask him was about Damien's observation around the 4 years needed for the baseline, and he concurred that because when you move to a new test, you always see a drop in scores, and then you see usually a fairly significant increase in the second year, that would actually warp your targets. So that's why Damien provided, here's some ways you could take a look at that, but I think, and I think he says it pretty clearly, if dispassionately in his paper, that that might require you to go back and reset something from the prior year. So I do think that's something, I mean, certainly the board should talk about, and I have concerns about the communications of that, because then I think it raises questions about the validity of the information and confidence in the system. So I look forward to seeing his paper, but that's something he validated what Damien said, that really you need 4 years to have confidence in that information.
Which goes back to Scott's point earlier. Any additions or corrections or changes to the growth resolution? Seeing none, will you take roll call, please?
Steve Yeager,
Yes.
Linda Rich,
Yes.
Steve Baker,
Yes?
Scott Best,
Yes.
Derek Weddleman, Jessica Dunn Feaser,
No.
Shane Robbins,
Yes.
Sheila Seadow,
Yes.
Claire Fayden Green,
No.
Rick Patachia,
I think yes.
Keith Gamble,
Yes.
Robert Lugo, Cheryl Ramsey, Jim Snap,
No.
Michelle Walker, Terry Wicker,
I will abstain.
recommendation is passed 10-4 with 1 abstention.
Thank you. And we have a request from Alan that by consensus, since we removed the whereas statement in the last 2 resolutions, we are also removing it in the first 2 resolutions. Do we have consensus to do that?
Yes.
Everybody? All right. Thank you very much. I believe we have organization for the State Board of Education presentation. Danielle, do you have a couple comments about that?
I believe I sent it in an email yesterday, the panel should have received, just to let you know that there will be at least an hour after a presentation for which I want to thank Scott and Steve for volunteering, well, asking and saying yes to going over some of the presentation today with the state board members. And then there will be an hour of a table activity. As suggested, I called up to Carrie to ask from a board's perspective how they may want to have interaction with you as a panel today. So there'll be an hour given for you to have intimate conversation with state board members before we come to the final end of the day where we talk through the resolutions with both groups. I think that's good.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Carrie?
Already do the performance resolution?
We did those at the last 2, we did the first 2, the other 2 at the last meeting. Any more business to come before the panel? Yeah, Rick?
Madam Superintendent, is there built into the system now a better process for recalling, for example, some of our ideas if they don't work out? For example, on this option B, if it indeed begins to feel like, look like, act like the current targeted growth model, which is bizarre and incredible, is there a way to recall that and redo it? Or do we have to wait for another 4 years?
Well, what I can tell you is we're getting ready to start the rulemaking process, which has to have and put it in place. And, you know, just as everything in, I guess, in statute, rule, you know, things can be changed at some point. I don't know that we're the decision makers of that, but that's how we got to this point. So that's all I can say is that the General Assembly said we need to re-examine the system that we were using and not use it in that manner in terms of the growth component. So we were tasked with doing our job here. So that's all I can say is that we're getting ready to do rulemaking, which is the process to start the new accountability system. And we'll have to make sure that we're diligent in our work, in communication. We're going to have some conversation with that amongst the panel today and amongst the board members in going forward and making sure we're diligent to make sure that it's a fair and transparent process as we move forward.
But you understand, as you state, if there's angst over any part of the K-8 model, it is with targeted growth nonsense. And frankly, my colleagues can't wait for it to be over. What I don't want to do is replace it with targeted growth light. I've taken a lot of, I should say, I've given a lot of credence to the statistician based upon his adamant view that this is going to be beneficial to kids.
I think that's our goal. That's our
That's right.
total
That is
goal,
our-
to see individual student growth. And
If I could find an argument against it more vehemently, then I would have used it. But I'll grant him this one. But we have to monitor it, because if it doesn't work, we got to put an end to it. Because there's an easy fix, and it's Model C. It's an easy fix. We come together, we say, kill it, go to C. Instead of dragging it on and dragging kids through things that they shouldn't be dragged through in schools, through things they shouldn't be dragged through. I commend all of us for the questions that we've had and the work that we've done, but there's some hurt out there, and there's some nervousness out there. And D has this ability to have, at least on the edges, a feel like what we're currently doing on growth. And that's dangerous. And it's going to be very hard for us I think, to present. And when we do, what I would recommend also is that we all come together and we have a presenter to see how we present the program to our colleagues back home, so that everybody's presenting the same thing, so we don't have 17 different presentations.
you are so right. Communication is very vital in going forward and actually presenting the system. You are right on.
Damien needs to be right on.
Thank you. I agree. Thank you. All right, we will adjourn, and the State Board of Education meeting will begin shortly.